Hello and welcome to this RICS webinar to introduce the consultation for the second edition of the RICS's Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the Built Environment Professional Standard. My name is Matthew Collins from the RICS Standards team, and I'm pleased to be hosting the event today. The consultation period for the second edition of the Whole Life Carbon Assessment Professional Standard launched on the 7th of March and remains open until the 18th of April. Details of how to participate included in the webinar details sent out to you. We'd actively encourage everyone to review the consultation document and provide feedback to the RICS on the standard. I'm delighted that we have over 1,000 people registered to attend the webinar today, and we want to encourage questions as part of today's event. This can be done through the chat function within the webinar platform and with questions put to the panel as in the final part of the webinar. Also, confirm that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available to both RICS members and non-members in the coming days through the various RICS channels. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our expert panel who will be speaking as part of the webinar today. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Simon Sturgis from Targeting Zero. Simon is the lead technical author of the Whole Life Carbon Assessment Professional Standard. Simon.
Good morning, or whatever your time zone is. Thank you for attending. I'm an architect by training. I was also had the same role with the professional statement first time around in 2017. I've also written guidance for the RIBA and Whole Life Carbon Policy for London. I'm a special advisor to the House of Parliament on Whole Life Carbon, and I've been involved in international standards EN 15978 and PAS 2080. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. I'd also like to introduce Clara Bagnall-George, an associate from Introba. Clara is also one of the technical authors of the updated professional standard, focusing specifically on operational energy and operational carbon. Hi, Clara.
Thanks so much, Matthew. So yes, I'm an associate at Introba, formerly called Elementa Consulting, previous to a few months ago. I am the co-author of CIBSE TM65, so I've got a kind of deep interest in the embodied carbon of MEP, but also really kind of interested in net zero carbon. So I set up LETI in 2017. I'm currently chair of the technical steering group of the net zero carbon building standard. So I'm kind of really interested in oversight around operational and embodied carbon and how they interact. And along with my colleague Louise Amo, we co-authored the energy section of this update.
Thanks, Clara. I'd like to introduce Louisa Bowles, Head of Sustainability and Partner at Hawkins Brown. Louisa is also part of the technical authorship team of the updated professional standard, focusing specifically on the building element categories. Hi, Louisa.
Hi, thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so a little bit about me. I lead the sustainability team at Hawkins Brown. We're a large design-led architectural firm. So I've been developing an expertise in embodied and whole life carbon over the last decade through research that we've been doing in the practice and the development of our own in-house measuring tool. I'm also a MES design advocate working with the GLA. As Clara mentioned, LETI, I've delivered and coordinated pieces of work with LETI around embodied carbon, and I'm also part of the net zero carbon building standard that's emerging here in the UK. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Louisa. Kate Orr, Environmental and Sustainability Lead at the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. Hi, Kate.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. So I sit as part of our Project Futures team within the IPA, and we're responsible for delivering our Transforming Infrastructure Performance Roadmap to 2030 programme. And one of my focus areas has been on carbon assessment, working across government and also externally with the likes of RICS to ensure that we have continued alignment in this area and making sure we have collaboration across the board. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Kate. Ethan Lewis, Director at EALA Impacts and also part of the RICS's external working group in respect to this standard. Hi, Ethan.
Hi, Matt. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. My name is Ethan Lewis. I'm a chartered building surveyor with the RICS, and I also work as a whole life carbon assessor. I'm director of EALA Impacts. We're based in Edinburgh. We're an architecture and building surveying consultancy focused on existing buildings and triple bottom line sustainability. And as Matt says, I was in the external working group for the professional statement.
Thanks, Ethan. And last but by no means least, Chris Fry, Managing Director of Accela Limited, and Chris was the technical author of ICMS 3, something which we'll touch upon later in the webinar. Hi, Chris.
Hi, thanks Matt. Hi everybody. Yeah, just leading an organisation called Accela, where we are helping to accelerate the green transition, particularly across infrastructure and the built environment, and also unlocking new forms of funding and finance. And yeah, really interested in the whole topic of whole life carbon assessment, benchmarking, and so on, as Matt said, involved in the ICMS standard version 3 last year.
Excellent, thank you, Chris. So I think without further delay, I'd like to sort of jump into the meat of today's presentation and invite Simon to talk through the content of the second edition, talk about the scope, what's changed from the first edition, and go into a bit more detail about what's actually included. So over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Matt. Before I go into this, I'd just like to mention the team. So apart from Louisa, who you've met, and Clara Bagnall-George, who you've met, there's also Louise Amo, who's working with Clara on the operational and embodied aspects of services and MEP. In addition, we have Lee Leston Jones of Cundall, who's working on, has been working on Module A. Chen Lee, also of Cundall, working on Module B. Paul Astle of Ramble, working on Modules C and D. Athena Papacosta, who is working with HS2, and was a co-author of the original 2017 document, and she's working specifically on infrastructure-related issues, making sure that is fully integrated. And then Jane Anderson, who is a co-reviewer, if you like, with me on the whole document, but has also been dealing with issues of general guidance. So thank you for that. So now, the key issues that we've tried to address in the update 2023 is in the UK, we've had the Climate Change Act changes, which are the 2019 and 2021. There were a new legislative requirements, and I think a lot of that was mirrored internationally with net zero and the various COPs. So what I'm saying, although it tends to be UK orientated, is actually I'll try and keep it as international as possible. There's also been, since we did the 2017 document, updates to EN 15978, which are coming out soon, and EN 17472, which came out last year. We've also had, of course, since 2017, the original document, new guidance from iStruct-E, CIBSE, REBA, and UK GBC, and so on in the UK, and no doubt parallel documents elsewhere. The other thing that's obviously particularly important is that ICMS 3 has come out, and we are now trying to ensure optimum synchronization between ICMS 3 and carbon accounting, so that those two work together. International application, I think it's important that what we've tried to do here is to make it less UK-centric. Obviously, to an extent it is, but what we've done, for example, instead of referring to RIBA project stages, we've referred to sort of more generic project stages, such as early design stage, technical design, and so on. We're also now trying to make the whole document a bit more accessible and less geeky, if I can put it like that. So we're specifically referencing things like infrastructure, things like housing schemes where they have roads and things in between, and retrofit. So we hope the whole document's going to be a lot more accessible, and we've got a lot more diagrams than we had before. And instead of being just purple and grey and black like the last document, we'll have every colour you can imagine. So it's much more friendly. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just contextualize things for you. So if you look at the bottom there, you can see the RICS professional statement in the middle there. But if we go back up to the top of the screen, this is sort of where we sit. So we've obviously there, we've got ISO and PAS standards, which I won't go into any great detail, but they cover things at a much higher level and much more sort of, well, sort of bad term, but globally. And PAS 28, of course, is something like to do with management and managing carbon assessment and so on. Then we've got sort of 3 standards. Now, there are others, but these are the sort of, I suppose, the key ones. There's EN 15978, which 3 of our team are involved with, and that has an update coming up 24-25, and that's to do with the environmental performance of buildings. Then we have a sort of parallel one, which is EN 17472, which is the environment performance civil engineering work. So that is also represented very strongly here. And then, of course, linking to both of those, we've got BSEN 15804, which is to do with environmental product declarations and how products are dealt with. So then we come down to the methodology, and I've shown there we've got the RICS professional statement update, and it's feeding in on the right there. You've got ICMS 3, so there's the modular structure is common to both, and will form the sort of basic cost and carbon reporting structure. Next slide, please. So this is really, and this will vary from country to country, but this sort of shows how things have evolved. So since the first RICS professional statement on whole life carbon, that top line of guidances have come out, all of whom, one way or another, reference the whole life carbon document. So we've got on the left there the RIBA guidance and the RIBA 2030 climate challenge. We've got the CIBSE TM65, and of course this TM54 as well. So both of those things are sort of, if you like, now re-influencing, if you like, the new version. iStruct have got how to calculate embodied carbon. UK Green Building Council, Net Zero Carbon Boost, I'm sure you're familiar with. The LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide, and of course there's several documents behind that as well. And then we have the construction playbook, the government's construction playbook, which doesn't specifically reference the professional RICS document, but it does tell you to do the things that it says in the document. So it sort of tacitly recognizes it. And then the Environmental Audit Select Committee produced a report last year which specifically references the RICS document, and that is now being reviewed by government departments, and in fact there's been a response to that. So the sort of whole idea of the RICS document is now becoming much more embedded in everybody's thinking. And then I've got another layer down that below there, which is, of course, this is feeding into things like BREEAM and LEED, not yet, but in fact the RICS document is broader in its carbon assessment than either BREEAM or LEED at this point in time. But it is feeding into things like software at the bottom, then green writing. At the moment, a number of tools like eTool and OneClick and so on will claim consistency with, or that they align with the RICS professional statement, i.e. the one that's current, not the new one coming out. This is not always entirely true, but we're trying to encourage the fact that these tools do align fully with the RICS professional statement, and it'll be the new one, obviously. And then there are things like planning. So we have two GLA in London, for example, but there are other examples around the country. We have got Policy SI2, which is about whole life carbon, and that very specifically references the RICS professional statement, and I was co-author of that. And then on the right there, we've got circular economy, which again covers some similar sort of stuff. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I just thought I'd cover here. This is, you probably recognize a version of this document. This is an update from the original document, and there's a couple of changes. I won't go into all of them because this is still evolving at the sort of EN 15978 level. But what we have got here is an A0 on the left there in purple, which is really specifically to do with infrastructure projects. We've also got in the middle there at the bottom, we've got B8, use activities not covered in B1 to B7. So for example, that might be car use on a motorway or something like that. And then on the right there, you'll see that D1 and D2 are split, are subsections of module D. So those are refinements. And within module B, for example, you will also find that some of those modules will be split a bit further as well. So there's just a bit more detail, a bit more refinement. And as I put at the bottom there, they both align with those two standards, one being buildings, one being infrastructure. The other thing you'll notice that biogenic carbon has been pulled out. This is to really make the point that if you're going to examine biogenic carbon, i.e. use of timber and other renewable resources and so on, you can't only count them within module A, you've got to count them within the whole of the embodied carbon story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. I'd now like to bring in Clara. Clara's going to talk more specifically around operational energy and operational carbon and the changes that we've proposing to introduce as part of the updated standard. So over to you, Clara.
Thank you. Oh, I just shared my screen and now it's not shared. So I just want to check that everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, we can see it, Clara. Yeah, well, certainly I can see it. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I'm going to give a 10-minute presentation on how we've beefed up the operational energy side of the professional statement. So I'm going to first talk about the scope of operational energy, then how guidance that we're providing on how to calculate operational energy, typical modelling inclusions, the advice that we're giving on energy metering, and the treatment of renewables. Is that slightly different in the update, and also the carbon conversion factors. And at the end, I'll touch a bit on the upgrades that the professional statement has been doing relating to embodied carbon of MEP. So I just want to shout out to all of the people who are involved in this section of work that I'm talking. So my co-author of this section is Louise Amo, and there were lots of key contributors both at Entroba and wider. So Julie Godfrey, Simon Wyatt, and Joe Jack, and Jane Anderson. Jane Anderson's involved in a lot with this statement, but Julie, Simon, and Joe Jack formed a little group, and they really supported the development of this. So thanks to them and my other colleagues, Will, Hugh, and Jada at Entroba. So the guidance, there's now clearer guidance of the scope of operational energy, so we can be really clear of what needs to be included. There's a minimum breakdown of reporting, and then clarity of the scope of what needs to be included within that breakdown. So you can find that in section 4.3. I won't go through it now, but it's just sharing that all is there, which I think is really helpful because that means everybody knows what's meant to be included in that operational energy piece of the whole life carbon assessment. There's also guidance on how to calculate operational energy. Now, this depends on what phase of the building that you're in. So if you're in the design phase, so even the early design phase or the kind of technical design phase, then you calculate your operational energy based on predictions, right? And so you need to use predictive operational energy modeling. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But if you're in the phase where the building is built and it's in operation, then you use metered data to understand your operational energy consumption. So we need to use predictive operational energy modelling, it's sometimes called performance modelling in our industry, in order to estimate the actual energy consumption of buildings. So there's various methods and ways of doing this. We've got CIBSE's TM54, Neighbours. If you're in America, we've got ASHRAE 90.1, and we've got PHPP, so the Passive House Planning Package, which estimates operational energy falling under TM54 as well. Depending on where you are in the world, I'm sure there are also other local equivalent operational energy estimation methods. And it's important that these estimates are refined at each design stage as we move forward. And they should be reported as a range depending on their level of uncertainty. So currently in the UK, compliance modelling using Part L 2021 isn't predictive enough. So it doesn't predict the actual operational energy consumption. So you can't use that within whole life carbon assessments. What we've done is provided really handy kind of cheat sheets, I suppose, which really describe of the scope of the items within the energy categories, what are they typically included within predictive energy modelling tools or not? We've also showcased for the kind of more the most used tools in the industry, specifically for those tools, which items are included and which items are not included. And if they're not included, how that you calculate them by hand. And that's really important because it means that the whole life carbon assessments that are being carried out by different consultants within the industry are all including the right elements of scope, no matter what tools that they're using, right? And we wanted to really make that clear to you and to those energy modelers, so we all know what to do. We've also given a lot of guidance on energy metering So we need to make sure that for non-domestic buildings, we can meter different elements of energy consumption so we can understand what's going on, and we provided guidance of how you can do that metering. That's really helpful at the design stage because that means you can set up the design right. We've given a kind of minimum standard and then a recommended and best practice way of metering that data. For residential, we don't expect the different energy uses are sub-metered. We just need to understand the total building use separated for any renewable energy generation and EV charging. If you specifically want to investigate energy consumption in more detail, I'm particularly interested in that because I'm a bit of an energy geek. Then you won't need to meter your energy sub-uses, and it provides guidance on that as well. So how to account for renewables? So the update accounts, the carbon accounting for renewables works slightly differently. So depending on if renewables actually used on site, second by second, or if they're exported to the grid, but then kind of used again by the building over the course of the year, or if they're just exported, that depends on how the carbon accounting works. And this is because if you export, if it's very sunny and a lot of buildings in your area are generating, let's say they have lots of PV and they're generating a lot of energy, they're not going to be using it at that time, so it's exported. And then at some point during the year, your building, needs additional energy, so you'll be using the grid. But we often use that term as like using the grid as a battery. We understand there's curves of renewable energy that you can generate on the building, and that doesn't match up with what you actually use at the time. And if you don't have batteries, that means in your actual building, you kind of use the grid as a battery, which is fine, and that's a good concept. It's just we need to recognize that only 80% of what is exported is actually re-imported again, and that's because of losses associated with the grid and associated with grid level storage. And this is important because as we're moving towards a renewable grid, more and more buildings will be having on-site renewables, which is great, but we want to be incentivizing buildings to actually use the energy that they're generating at the time they're generating it, because that will make a much more efficient renewable grid infrastructure. And therefore, because we want to incentivize that, it's important to fully realize the carbon benefits of doing that. And this example shows a building that if it's generating 50% of the energy over the course of the year on site, that actually a certain proportion of it is exported and re-imported, a certain amount of it is lost, a certain amount is used on site, and then you need some electricity from the grid. And another example where you might be generating a lot of energy, so more than your building needs, and therefore some of it will be lost and some of it will be exported. Now, that energy, that modelling of understanding the time of use and what energy is being used at that exact moment, not all buildings will be doing that. So the professional statements gives, again, a bit of a cheat sheet table saying, okay, depending on how much proportion overall you're generating on site, you can assume certain amounts will be used at that time, or certain amounts will be exported and re-imported. So we're not placing additional burden on the modelling, but we're incentivizing the right choices to help us move towards a low carbon grid. So carbon conversion factors. Now this is all about how we understand the carbon emissions associated with the energy that our buildings are using. Now this includes various elements of carbon, and I won't go through this with you now, but I just wanted to reassure you about all of the different elements of carbon that we're including in that factor. They're all bundled together, so it's only one number that you times per kilowatt hour by. But the big thing is here, embodied carbon of infrastructure. So whereas the grey and the dark blue and this bright blue here, they were included in the original professional statement, that we're adding in the embodied carbon of infrastructure because that's a really important consideration. So we've done some analysis on the embodied carbon of infrastructure, and that needs to be included when you think about the carbon emissions associated with using a kilowatt hour of electricity. Right. So let's go a little bit into details. I hope you don't mind. I've got 2.5 minutes left, and I'm hoping this is the kind of key thing that we're changing within this update. So we've got 3 different carbon conversion sets, and that's how you translate energy to carbon. And this depends on what the purpose of the whole life carbon assessment is, right? You use set 1 if you're trying to make design decisions. You use set 2 if you're trying to understand the prediction of carbon over the we call it reference service period, but it's often 60 years. And set 3 is for that annual carbon accounting. So I'm going to go through them in a bit more detail. I'm going to start with set 2. So this is to be used if you want to predict the carbon over the reference service period, so over about, let's say, 60 years. So that's what we use in the UK. And it includes the benefit of renewables, as described just a minute ago, and it includes our understanding of a decarbonised grid. So we're using the FES energy scenarios as our assumptions for that decarbonised grid. Pretty simple. Set 3 is for annual reporting, so this is just for the year, right? So we need to do corporate reporting often in many organisations, and so you look at what energy did we use in that specific year, you times it by a carbon factor associated with that specific year, for our operational energy, and same for our embodied carbon relating to refurbishment. So that's pretty simple. Now I want to move on to set 1. Now set 1 is all about understanding the whole life carbon consequences of design decisions that influence both operational energy and embodied carbon. So like a heating system selection, or whether you're adding that extra layer of insulation. Now the relationship between embodied carbon and operational carbon, that really changes depending on the decarbonisation of the grid. So you can see here, if we assume no grid decarbonisation over 60 years, then it's about 50-50, right? And if we include grid decarbonisation, then we have our embodied carbon. I don't think they're quite scaled right, sorry, but our operational carbon really reduces. Now, the tricky thing is that the actual ability of the grid to decarbonise depends on our energy use of buildings, right? If we continue to use a lot of energy in buildings, our grid won't decarbonise at all, right? But so we need to really be reducing those the energy that buildings use. So the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is being developed this year, and previously LETI and RBA and UK GPC and others have been sharing net zero energy limits. So a certain amount of energy that your building can use, and that is then compatible with this net zero grid. And so we have this central methodology called net zero carbon compatible, where if you are using your fair share, your budget of your net zero energy limit, then you assume your grid decarbonised grid factor, and any kilowatt hour of electricity above that, then you assume a non-decarbonised grid factor, because actually our grid won't be able to decarbonise if all our buildings use so much energy. So this methodology has been developed from a piece of work that LETI did. So if you're interested in this, there's a whole webinar about it. So go to the Whole Life Carbon webinar series page, and you can watch the webinar, and you can read the document, and that sets out really the benefits of this approach. But effectively, this carbon conversion set 1, which is all about making design decisions, you have a central net zero compatible scenario, so you can understand of your project what's going on, and if which has the lowest whole life carbon, and then you can see, okay, but with you can just sense check, if we have no grid decarbonisation, what's the lowest option? If we had grid decarbonisation, what's the lowest option? But you should be using the central net zero compatible scenario to make design decisions. I had not very long to go through all of that, and oh gosh, I've gone over by 3 minutes, apologies, Matt. So I'll just skip through. We've really beefed up the embodied carbon of MEP piece within the PS, and it builds on the work of TM65, and it gives really handy tools to how you measure quantities, what assumptions to use if you're not quite sure what your system is yet, and things like that. All right, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Clara. Really, really interesting. And yeah, we're proposing a lot of changes in the updated standard. So yeah, thank you for that whistle stop tour through them. And yeah, we'll just encourage everybody to go and read the read the consultation version of the standard and feedback appropriately. Or like you say, there's a LETI webinar that goes into a lot more detail, which I would encourage people to go away and watch and understand it in more detail. So thank you for that. So yeah, now I'd like to bring in Louisa to talk about the reporting requirements of the updated document and a little bit more about the levels of granularity that we're going into in terms of part of those sort of lifestyle cycle stages reporting. So thank you, Louisa.
Thank you. Thanks very much. No slides here. I'm just going to go through a bit of a narrative around why we've done what we've done and what you'll see in the consultation. So the updates that we've made aim to resolve a lot of inconsistency that we believe we've been seeing in measuring and reporting. Now there's a much greater uptake in embodied and whole life carbon analysis. So the information on grouping of building or asset elements for measuring and reporting can be found in section 3.2 of the proposed standard alongside Appendix C. To align with the aspiration of measuring a number of times now during the design and the delivery process, there are 3 proposed levels of granularity for buildings. We're keen, however, to emphasize that the scope of the measurement should not change. And this is why the collection of more detailed data will be important through the BECD, so that even when reporting at concept level, we know there's an allowance for everything that will be included in the actual asset. So at concept level, we may only require some high-level figures to ensure they're within a sensible range, and also to drive good decision-making based on one direction versus another, to focus the client and the design team on any efficiencies required to reduce the overall emissions as the project progresses. As the design develops, the data can be broken down much further, so how elements compare to each other and to benchmarks can be examined in more detail. There are 2 levels of granularity for this. The hope is that as people get used to the new level of greater detail, that level of reporting becomes more common. The BECD will be set up to collect this level of detail, and the hope is that benchmarks and design decisions become more and more accurate. There is guidance in the document saying that if you can break the data down earlier in the process to the more finer level of detail, this is fine, as long as the overall reporting in categories is followed for consistency. And finally, there are detailed scope notes to ensure that everyone is including the same parts of the building in their design within each element, and also not missing parts out. The structure of the building element categories broadly follows the RICS standard, the previous version, and the majority of the detailed breakdown is drawn from the NRM3. Consultation with this group was held during the production of the information, so any key discrepancies you might note have been intentional for the purposes of measuring carbon compared to cost. And I'm understanding that after the consultation comments are received back, there may be some further considerations as to how to realign the NRM. There may also be queries on how this aligns with ICMS3. We've had a lot of early conversations about this, and work was done to map the EN 15978 life cycle stages against the level 2 categories. At the deeper levels of detail, however, the decision was made to create a mapping rather than develop the RICS standard to fully align. And I believe RICS are working on this, and functionality will be made available in the BECD to enable both sets of reporting when looking at carbon and cost together. An element breakdown for infrastructure along the same lines is also provided in Appendix D. Reporting requirements can be found in Section 5 and the Appendices E and F for buildings and infrastructure respectively. There are mandatory parts of information to be covered in the reporting similar to the 2017 version of the standard. We've introduced the idea of contingencies into the document as well, and these are proposed to vary at different design stages to indicate that at earlier stages we are going to see some uncertainty in data and inclusion within the design and levels of accuracy, which will gradually fall as we get through the design process. A reporting template is provided in the consultation document. It's an Excel with several tabs containing inputs and outputs. So the inputs cover the measurement of assets at concept and detailed level, infrastructure, energy and water. It has been aligned to what we believe will be the emerging EN 15978, so some life cycle stages might be a little bit different compared to the 2017 version. The inputs on the reporting template are then proposed to be displayed in consistent outputs as per the sheets 1.2 and 1.1. And this covers high-level key data, such as what might be reported when you're trying to demonstrate meeting net zero standards, etc. Then there's a schedule for how to display data against the building elements and life cycle stages, and a schedule for energy reporting. I think I'll leave it there and then hand back to Matt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louisa. Really helpful, and hopefully that's given everybody a great idea of some of those changes that we're looking to introduce. And as I can already see in the chat, there's an awful lot of questions around some of these things, which is great. I'd like to go into some the other members of the panel and asking some specific questions to them, drawing on their experience of whole life carbon assessment and carbon reporting specifically. Start with Ethan. Ethan, as a practitioner of whole life carbon assessment, and in terms of, you know, with a particular focus on existing buildings, how do you see the influence of the changes made or proposed in the updated standard? And again, I suppose going into particularly in respect to the roles and responsibilities of a chartered surveyor, just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was an interesting discussion point during the process of rewriting the document about qualifications for assessors. You know, the term assessor is used throughout, and it's intentionally vague because, you know, there isn't currently a qualification for it. I would say that several types of chartered surveyor are well set up for it. Building surveyors like myself, quantity surveyors, obviously, engineers, architects could all do that role. And you know, there's always this debate about when a new standard comes in, do you need a new specialism to service it? And I think that will, you know, that will cause something in the market. The increasing sort of maturity and level of sort of reliability that this document will bring in, I think we'll see it feature in more and more parts of the industry, which I think can only be a good thing. I think the interoperability of it, you know, the previous speakers have spoken a lot about that. It's now far more connected in with the RIBA plan of works, ICMS3, and lots of other standards. And I think that they're sort of longer established, and you know, people are used to talking in those terms of, you know, RIBA work stages, ICMS3 terminology, and it's just going to enable far more multifaceted and coordinated decision making. And you know, as lead consultants, as most of us on this call will find ourselves to be, that just promotes better discussion. I think the other thing, and Louise was talking about it there, the increased confidence because of the new guidance to do this at early design stage level means those strategic decisions are made better. I think a lot of us find ourselves grappling with difficult carbon-based decisions too late on. The strategic moves have already been made, and so all you're doing is firefighting and trying to find the least worst solution at sort of the more detailed stages, whereas I think this gives us the opportunity to sort those out early on. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention is the greater definition around module D and bringing circular economy into it. I think there's far more conversation I'm finding about how the circular economy is really a key part to achieving this sort of move to net zero. So I think that as well, because especially with existing buildings essentially arrive at a project already existing, and so understanding what's coming out of them and moving into stage A, and that sort of the circularity of this. There's someone else's D feeds into your stage A, and I think the ability that the new document gives us to quantify that and try to put some framing around that will enable just better decision making and move us away from that whole, you know, just juggling up between different wall construction types when the question should have been, do we need a wall at all? And I think that will really help us with that, you know, get to that place.
Yeah, but excellent. Thank you, Ethan. And I'd love to, you know, carry on the conversation for much longer than unfortunately the time we've got available to us today, but thank you for that. Moving on, Kay, talking obviously from a specific UK perspective here, how can the updated whole life carbon assessment professional standard help to meet the requirements of the construction playbook 2022 and the overall target of net zero by 2050?
Thanks, Matt. I think for a long time, we've seen the lack of carbon data or complexity of carbon assessment render us almost helpless and sometimes even cloud our better judgments on simple things, the basics of having a good design strategy, logic and common sense, for example. And we still need to remember those basics. The standards I see works in conjunction with existing processes and give us better insights to inform designs and decisions that will drive better outcome. And I see sort of two streams in how the standard can help drive us towards net zero 2050. So as with any optimization work, there are pragmatic changes that you can make in the immediate term that will have major impacts, and then longer term it's about using data to refine, drive better performance and continuous improvement. So ultimately the standard will drive better consistency in carbon assessment and reporting, ensuring that, you know, carbon disclosure post completion meets the quality, transparency and standardization required to build a database for benchmarking, for example. So this improved the future state of data, unlocking further insights on carbon hotspots, decarbonisation opportunities, and allows us to continuously stretch targets, so driving impact in the longer term. But most importantly, I think in the immediate term, it provides a more pragmatic way of assessing carbon during the early stages of the project, where we have the greatest influence to drive down carbon. And I think all too often we become fixated to addressing the lack of carbon data or high uncertainty of carbon data, and that's something that we need to be comfortable with. And understanding the purpose of any carbon assessment is very important to this, because that will vary by project stage, determines the level of detailed type of data. And the standard, I think, can capture that and provide a better approach to early stage assessment, support optioneering, and maximize the potential to drive down carbon, as some of our speakers have already highlighted. Currently, studies show that we are on track for a 3 to 4 degrees rise in temperature, so we're not doing enough. Our ecosystem is collapsing, resources are finite, and we just can't afford inaction. The standard doesn't have all the answers, and it's not expected to, so there's still challenges, but the planet isn't waiting for perfection, as we all know. So for all the reasons mentioned, I personally think that the standard will drive a step change towards a better future state, and we can work together to address those challenges as well. So yeah, a lot of opportunities I see for the update.
Thank you for that, Kano. Really interesting, and again, would love to continue the conversation for much longer than we've got, but thank you very much for that. Really helpful. Moving on to Chris, sort of touching on infrastructure, because obviously the expanded scope of the standard now, includes infrastructure alongside buildings. How will the updated standard enable assets to be designed and operated as effectively and efficiently as possible? Looking at in terms of trade-offs between embodied carbon, operational energy and carbon, and user carbon, really from an infrastructure perspective. Just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure, Matt. I think it's great that infrastructure is, very much part of what the standard is looking to support, and that holistic view of the built environment, I think, can only be helpful in that that mission that we're all on to drive towards net zero and accelerate the change and the understanding. I think working together across the built environment is a great way to do that. Yeah, I'm particularly excited about kind of 3 aspects in terms of that infrastructure question and how taking this whole life approach and the new version of the guidance can help us. The first thing really is that I think the guide is very much the how-to. We've got lots of other standards, we've got lots of other tools in infrastructure. On the larger projects anyway, there'll be some pretty sophisticated software and models and so on used as well, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that kind of thinking through and understanding and kind of working with those tools is automatic. There's a lot of people trying to get to grips with all of this as well, and the tools will of course not give you the right answer if you don't put the right information in. So I think the guide really serves that purpose of and helping. Infrastructure is complex, long supply chains, long durations of projects, different phases of projects, enabling works through to different phases, and so I think and we have to think, it's not just the mega projects. There are lots of small scale infrastructure interventions across across the UK, across other jurisdictions as well, and for those projects there's perhaps less of that sort of database, less of that information, less capacity, less resource. So having a very practical guidance is really helpful, I think. The second thing is around visibility, and visibility of the data won't be perfect. I totally agree with Kay, and we can't wait for that. We have to use the data we have, but giving more visibility for it and using that in a consistent way, and the guide very much is about consistency, and it's consistency for good. Not all consistency is always good, because you can constrain best practice and innovation, but this is very much consistency for good, transparency, and I think there's nice clear guidance, for example, categorizing infrastructure, different types, but also thinking about other sort of the functional requirements, how many vehicles are being transported, how many containers per year in a port, what's the pattern of use, and these by sort of describing those aspects and providing that sort of transparency on that side as well as on the sort of carbon data side, you can start to, you know, normalize and benchmark. So we're really passionate about benchmarking, and at Excella done a lot of work on that around transport infrastructure, and very much a kind of bottom-up approach. So and I think this guide will help to, you know, help people to sort of look into things in more detail, because we may not get meaningful results by benchmarking at the level of a whole infrastructure asset, but if you start to break that down and the guide gives you ways of doing that, then you can get some really interesting insights from benchmarking, and then show how you can reduce the material consumption, because, you know, other projects, maybe buildings projects as well, with similar components can show you the way. And then the third thing for me is that there's a good emphasis on assets and not just projects. So with, for example, inclusion of the sort of project type of refurbishment, retrofit, and so on. So it's very much kind of, the built environment is not just about the new projects, it's about all the assets we have around us and how we look after those, refurbish those, and that helps to shift towards the circular thinking. And, you know, agreeing with Ethan there with, you know, module C, module B, module D as well. So looking to the end of life, and then looking to sort of beyond the boundaries and the circular thinking. And I think this is a stepping stone. You know, we've got a lot to do in our individual asset areas, but beyond that, we can look at systems of systems as well. And again, you know, look for further gains and further acceleration of the decarbonisation by looking at it that way. So I think that's really welcome as well.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Chris. Really helpful, and I'm sure the attendees will find it likewise. I'd now like to invite everybody, all the panelists, to turn their cameras on, and we're going to go into a few questions from the attendees today. Thank you everybody for your questions. We've had a lot of questions in the time available to us. Unfortunately, we're not going to get through all of them, but for those that are quite specific, I would encourage you to, if there's a particular point of the consultation document that your question is on, I would actively encourage you to go on and feed that back as part of the consultation. You know, there's a lot of information in the updated standard. There's a lot of, you know, new approaches, new information, some of which is, you know, this is a consultation version, so this isn't the final version, but we would encourage as much feedback and as possible. So if you've got a particular question that we don't manage to cover in the next 13 minutes or so, then please feed that back as part of the consultation, and we will cover it off that way. But I suppose to kick us off, hopefully this is a fairly straightforward one, possibly for you, Simon, or possibly Louisa. Questions come in saying, is A0 intended to cover site preparation works? I'd welcome clarification of where things like emissions from removal of material from site prior to commencement of construction would fall. And I guess that falls into the category of we've now included, you know, prior demolition as part of module A. So I don't know if Simon wants to touch on that.
Yeah, I think what we've done is in the current version, the 2017 version, previous demolition is kind of excluded. We brought it in, and it will now be included in A5 as part of the construction works. There was another question I noticed about crane bases, which I think would come into that territory in the same way. So, you know, it'd be part of temporary works, demolition, and so on.
Yeah, I think that hopefully that answers it. Thank you, Simon. Question, Clara, just coming to you. Hopefully, your presentation will have hopefully answered this, but again, I would encourage the person that's posed this question to go into the consultation and read the detail in them. But it says, in terms of operational energy, what level of detail is required at what stage, and how is this aligned with metrics such as neighbours or TM54? Currently, there's a lot of guidance all doing the same sort of thinking, but slightly differently. It would be great if the guidance clarified other standards in relationship with it.
Thank you. So the guidance provides options or tool palettes of which predictive modelling software you can use. And I suppose you need to, if you're making design decisions that relate to the reason why you do a whole life carbon assessment is because you want to understand the operational and the embodied carbon, right? And you want to understand how they relate to each other. And if you do that, you need to understand both the operational and the embodied in a similar level of resolution. So yeah, we need to make sure that at early stage, you can do kind of box model operational models, and similarly, well, there's a lot of guidance on the way that you can assess embodied carbon at earlier stages within the RICS, so within the PS. So yeah, I think it's about level of resolution of detail as the design progresses. But it is really important that even at an early stage to understand, for some typical, if it's a residential development, some typical dwellings, or if you've got a non-residential development, some box modelling. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. Louisa, there's a specific question for you, which I don't know if you just want to touch upon. Again, I think some of your presentation covered that off, but let me just find it. Yeah, here we go. Please, could you suggest an appropriate response to comment that only certain lifestyle stages, for example, just A to C, are viable to assess? I work for a local authority, and planning applications do not want to use the full scope of assessment, claiming that they are unable to capture information needed to fully report, or that a full scope would be too expensive and time consuming to address. If you've got any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the new standard provides a lot more detail. It goes through every life cycle stage that you're likely to come across and describes what that life cycle stage includes and how to measure it or where to find the data. There's also an awful lot more default data in there as well. So if you can't find figures on things, there are default figures for a much wider range of materials now as well. So I think have a read through the consultation version, because we're hoping that will certainly go a long way to combating some of these thoughts around time and complication, etc.
Matthew, if I could just add to that, the other thing we've tried to do is to ensure that it's easier to make strategic decisions at early stages, because I think that is always a fundamental problem, is that you get too, as Ethan said a bit earlier, that you get too far down the road before you start to do carbon calculations. So we've tried to make it easier to do some generic assessments at early stages.
Yeah, absolutely, Simon. Thank you, and thank you, Louisa. A couple of questions that I'll take in terms of the consultation itself. People asking when the second edition will be available to review, and how to access the consultation document. Well, the second edition is available to review now, or at least the consultation version of it. As I said, this is a process that the RICS goes through with a standard such as this to launch the consultation and obtain industry and overall feedback on it. So that document is available to review now. And how do we access the consultation document? Well, hopefully there will have been a link to the consultation in the webinar information sent out, but that certainly can be sent to all of the people registered to attend the webinar after the event. There's an RICS sort of landing page with more information on the consultation as a whole, what we're looking to achieve from it, and actually a bit more information on the updated standard itself. In terms of the consultation, there's various ways to feedback. We have a specific questionnaire that we've created that asks specific questions on the consultation document. We encourage feedback. You can go in and comment on particular paragraphs of the updated standard. We're running round tables and kind of working workshops throughout the consultation period that we're actively encouraging people to register for, to sort of bring people together to have a discussion about the standard. So there's lots of different ways that we're promoting this, but ultimately can't stress it enough. The document is quite a long one, but it's intentionally done that way because it is an important document. So we would encourage people to go away, read it, and feedback to us in ever which way is appropriate to them. Couple more questions before we wrap up, and I suppose Ethan, feeding back on what you were saying, There's a question here. We're seeing more reuse of materials between different buildings, e.g. raised access floors and steel. How is this considered in the update? I don't know if that's something you want to...
Yeah, no, it is something absolutely key, and you know, I think Simon and the team did a really good job of this. Module D, there's a really good diagram actually showing material flows out of the back of the back of that sort of linear presentation of the modules A to D, and it really shows it as a building and an asset in a wider environment. I think, which I think is really key. None of these, buildings and projects are not little isolated islands. They do exist more widely. I think energy flows in and out as well, I think, are really well captured here, not just material flows. But I think also, there's a note of warning in the guidance about how you calculate avoided impacts between projects, because it is difficult to guarantee that certain things will be treated in certain ways. So there is that caveat there, but no, I think the explanation in module D is really good, and I'd encourage people, especially those working with this, trying to puzzle out conceptually how do we treat this. I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that part of the thing. I actually think the way that we treat it is we put module D first. We do D and then A, because typically you do want to spot those things coming out of the environment around you, feeding into your project, and especially the focus, as Chris was saying, about existing assets. That's very realistic looking at it that way, I would say.
Thank you, Ethan. Yeah. Question on one of the kind of new concepts, I suppose, if you like, that we've introduced into the updated document. Question here, it was mentioned that contingency is being advised to be added to carbon estimates. Have these been defined for each design stage, and if so, what's formed the basis of these? Simon, Louisa, I don't know if one of you wants to come in on those.
Yeah, well, I think what we've tried to do is, there's a slight anomaly. When you do a carbon calculation, it quite often comes down to decimal points things, which is probably a little optimistic in terms of accuracy. So what we've brought in is the kind of similar concept to cost management, which is adding in a risk factor which diminishes. So at the beginning, early stage will be, I think the risk factor is about 10%, then it reduces to 5% and so on. So the idea is that you do your calculation, then you add on the risk factor so that it's as you say, it's a contingency. And I think that is quite a crucial aspect, because I think there's an assumption that these figures are very, very precise when, as I say, I think that's probably a little optimistic.
No, thank you, Simon. And yeah, I would just echo that. I'm a chartered quantity surveyor, and the concept of cost contingency or risk contingency, however you want to term it, depending on who holds that, is one that is used day in, day out when producing cost plans and cost estimates. So introducing that idea as part of the carbon assessment, I think, is something that's really important. And we all know that the first number you give someone is the one that they're most likely going to remember. So we need to make sure that that is a true reflection of where you are in terms of undertaking your whole life carbon assessment. Is there one very quick one? Yeah, I suppose this is quite I don't know if we can answer this, but it's quite a pertinent question that says, until the BECD, the Built Environment Carbon Database, is published, where will the data for the early project stages be available to inform assessments? I'm not sure we can give a definitive answer on that, other than to say, previous assessments that have been undertaken, there is information out there. Obviously, what the BECD is looking to do is bring all of that together and make it, freely available to assessors and organisations and individuals to use. But I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts on that. Chris, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. I think in the world of infrastructure, the clients and the asset owners have been building stuff for a while, and for a number of years, some level of carbon assessment has been going on. So it's a case of trying to draw out the best available, really, and that isn't always easy, because of course the standards at the time haven't necessarily been the same as they are now, and the tools, but there certainly is there can be data out there, and then it's kind of trying to use that in an intelligent way, in a selective way, of course, but yeah, there definitely are good data sets out there for particular clients and portfolios, I think.
If I could just say one quick thing, I think the real key issue, in fact, what started this, it started as being known as the consistency project. And I think that's the thing we want to try and achieve, is greater consistency, because a lot of the data that's out there comes from different sources using different tools and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to kind of get reliable comparators.
No, excellent, Simon. Thank you. And I think that's a great place to leave this. And just remains for me to say thank you to everybody, all the panelists. You've been really helpful, and really interesting, insightful presentations and responses. And thank you to everybody attendee-wise for taking the time to join the webinar today, and just reiterate to go in and review the consultation and provide feedback to us. So thank you everybody, and have a great day.